Well, good afternoon, everyone, and kia ora koutou, or kia ora kōrua at this point. We are hosting live a Zoom talk by Dr. Elizabeth Aitken-Rose as one of the Guests of the Artists series of talks, originally intended to be live floor talks in association with the 2021 Walters Prize. Elizabeth's going to talk and reflect, make comment on the work of artist Sonya Lacey, who was a nominee for the Walters Prize in 2021 with her outstanding installation Weekend. Elizabeth, I'm going to hand over to you, but first of all, I will point out that Elizabeth is currently senior lecturer at the University of Auckland School of Architecture and Planning, and an urban planner specialised in history and theory, cultural policy, including the creative arts, heritage and civic life. And she'll talk to how her concepts of public space marry with the work Weekend by Sonya, and we'll join you again at the end. Otherwise, over to you, Elizabeth, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Natasha, and lovely to see you, Sonya. I might begin by saying that all of the Walters finalists I thought were outstanding. Each work exquisitely crafted and representing such diverse practices, each with layers of meaning and provocation, and all of them by women. As Natasha has noted, I'm not an art historian or a critic, so the perspective I bring to multiple ways of seeing and interpreting these works is that of an urban planner, and one particularly interested in culture, the culture of cities, palimpsest, creativity, the organisation of collective living and social justice, attuned to and respective of the bedrock of nature. Like the great urban historian Lewis Mumford, I believe that the planner's task is not zoning and regulation, although the latter is important, but to understand and unite culture in all its forms. I'm honoured to have the opportunity to reflect on Sonya Lacey's work, The Weekend, with its incredibly intriguing strata. One is taken into the St. Bride's swimming pool, the steps and the brass handrails, a visual ephemeral kaleidoscope that references water and women swimming in a foreign past, an ink and paper world now almost extinct. The Victorian philanthropists who understood that a healthy and contented workforce was good for business, leisure and enjoyment supported productivity, escape, but within patriarchal dictates. The water, the blue gold, the true blue gold of human life, connected historically to the feminine and shared themes in Sonya's earlier work. The sonic whirring of the offstage projectors, water, printing presses, and shifting technologies, and the catalogue that explained that the pool was eventually closed for health and safety reasons. An excuse for publicans and school swimming pool closures in New Zealand today, if I might say, despite the learning to swim is fundamental in this maritime country, and swimming one of the most benign forms of athletic activity. But above all, perhaps the importance of public places and spaces free of charge. Often governments put particularly planners put functional emphasis on water, housing, food supply, waste disposal, energy and communications from the streets through now to telecommunications. And all are fundamental and to various degrees challenged by the privatizing neoliberal ideologies that have actually dominated Western politics for the last 40 years. Sewerage systems, property development, they're certainly necessary, but they are not the essence of city living. It's government, education, social services, and I would argue the expressive arts. And important and intertwined, but often marginalised, are the civic places, libraries, museums, art galleries, our parks and swimming pools. Those places generally open and accessible to all, well-designed, well-maintained, entertaining, and above all, I think, essential to democracy, a sense of place and community. We now live in a world of increasing polarization and retreat from public engagement. This has been identified as the real pandemic of our age, with its emphasis on retreat, distance, and the rise of the virtual world. Questions have been raised, indeed, about the future of the city, and in New Zealand, around the quest for more intense development that completely contradicts the distancing of COVID. Nonetheless, we've seen that human beings are social, and the frustrations of restrictions evident, despite current compelling good sense. Public resources ebb and flow around communal investment and are easily cut in balancing budgets and with efficiency priorities. But the places and programs lost are not readily reinvigorated, and some are irreplaceable. Auckland has been shaped by the opening and shutting of bank books, to quote James K. Baxter. It has a tradition of effacing its heritage, and there are few buildings left of significance. For instance, those preserved for their contribution to the city's publishing and print media. I could only find two. Its civic places are under attack. Witness the privatisation of Aotearoa Square, the civic administration building now turned into private apartments, and indeed the heritage significance of its facade has been effaced. We see it too in the redevelopment of public parks, in the shrinkage of library and recreational facilities. I moved back to those public swimming pools. And Manukau City is so interesting, or was so interesting here, in that it did provide public swimming pools as absolutely essential and free to its population, but this has come under attack with the formation of the super city. And the city's great cultural institutions survive on a knife edge and increasingly reliant on philanthropy rather than the public purse. I return to Sonya. Her work takes the past to make something new in the present, with many messages for the future. Beneath its beauty is the sweat and delight of working class women, and the importance of places where people can commune outside of work. How these are provided and maintained is a moot point, and certainly one for continuing public debate. Sonya also takes work outside of the traditional confines of the art gallery. Her practice engages with civic justice, the narratives of the street, the lives of the other, and the vicissitudes of change, technological, social, and economic.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's a beautiful commentary on Sonya's work. Sonya, first of all, do you have anything to reflect on, anything that aligns at all with how you were imagining particularly the people and the time of the St. Bride pool?
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was really nice to hear you speaking about the sort of civic structures and how the work fits into it. Yeah, I was furiously taking notes because it was very interesting while my camera was off. I really liked the phrase swimming was the most benign form of athletic activity. I was trying to think about that. It's certainly a sort of gentle, it's certainly gentle in terms of impact, and you know, having just had the Olympics and the Paralympics, I guess a lot of that sort of more high performance side of athletic ability has been on my mind. And I really related to what another phrase that you said about that water has always been kind of thought about in terms of its function. I thought that was quite a striking thing to say as well. Those are some of the points that I picked up on in the talk.
What was that last point actually?
Elizabeth, you said that we've always viewed water, I think, at least, you know, please correct me if I've got this wrong, but you were talking about the functional, the emphasis on water's functionality.
Well, it's absolutely fundamental to human life. And that there is nothing more fundamental, in fact, to the survival of the human being. On top of that, we have food and shelter, and then you start. But and I do think that one of the biggest issues that we face, and you can see this in climate change, is around water. Too much of it and too little of it. And of course, it's also absolutely fundamental to our food supply, not just to the fact that we need to drink it, but and we need to be able to drink clean water. But it is the font of everything else too. So I find it really fascinating that to begin with that kind of layer of what's so essential to being human, and then looking at how your work developed that into, you know, the sort of fluid space that people could enjoy, but also under the restrictions of those philanthropic industrialists, which I'm really very familiar with in terms of planning, because in many respects they led to, particularly in Britain, where, you know, the Industrial Revolution was ignited, they led to the model towns and new ways of living and new forms of housing, but often were incredibly patriarchal in terms of what they supplied. Like, there was never a pub, for instance, and if you go and look at a place like Port Sunlight, which was built by William Lever, who made an enormous amount of money out of Sunlight soap, he had all sorts of public health regulations and so on. So there was a kind of a freedom and an acknowledgement of the importance of recreation and actually, you know, work-life balance in an early sense, but in a very controlled kind of way. So I found that I didn't know about the St. Bride's Pool, and I just found that fascinating in terms of thinking about those women actually. And
I think it wasn't just women.
Yes,
it wasn't just women. It was it was open to women and men were separated for most of for the swimming activities, and I think they were charged different prices. And
really,
I think so.
Yeah.
I might.
Well, I guess I was thinking largely about the women.
I usually think about the women too.
But I think the tips used to be segregated as well. I mean, We used to segregate our movie theatres, and I mean, yes, women were hidden from men, or
Yes,
yeah.
I also really enjoyed you drawing in the comment about loneliness as the real pandemic of our age, and thinking about that in parallel to Sonia's presentation of the pool, and especially Sonya, when you've talked about the research you did in the archive, because it sounds very chatty. You know, all the anecdotes and the letters to the editor and the media. My sense is that the pool was full, lively, you know, dirty because it was so used. That's the impression that I had. And, you know, that's one way, I guess, one litmus test of acknowledging when a public facility is working well. Although we don't necessarily like it. I'm very near the Mount Albert Aquatic Centre, and it's similarly incredibly busy. And for some people, that's quite off-putting now. We're not used to people's bodies being really so close to each other. I just wondered if, Sonya, you could give a bit of insight into what you found out about how the pool was used. I don't think we've talked about that elsewhere. And even now you've remarked that the swimming times were segregated, and I know that it was used by workers perhaps at lunchtime, perhaps after work. What else do you know about its actual use and who was free to use it and that sort of thing?
It was, I can tell you that there were certain pools set aside for first class bathing and certain pools set aside for second class bathing. So the people higher up the hierarchy, the kind of management could cleanse themselves in one and a more private pool, whereas it was cheaper and the more kind of people on the floor, the factory floor, would use the bigger pool. I know that you hired bathing suits and towels. You wouldn't bring your own. Yeah, I can tell you if I look at my computer.
Would that have been common though, do you think, Elizabeth, at that time, to have sort of segregated, socially segregated bathing areas?
I think it would be very, very common. And an interesting aspect of this too, what I hadn't really thought about, was around sanitation. So was this also a way of making certain that your workers had a bath?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
I'm speculating, but
yeah. So that goes right back to William Lever, who was kind of intent on morally and physically improving his workforce, and quite an emphasis on around health. So and certainly in Britain, and undoubtedly it's still there. You know, reinforcing the class system was you know, incredibly prevalent in terms of access to amenities. So
that's one thing I was wondering about, actually. Yeah, like it seems so prescriptive in terms of prescriptive and very defined in terms of like who was part of this class, who was part of that class. So for example, there was one first class bath for females, which was from 4 to 9 p.m. on Wednesdays. Oh no, that was on that. No, sorry, that was 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Wednesdays, and then from 4 until 9 p.m. on Wednesdays, it was a second class bath for females. So females could only bathe once a week. It had to be on a Wednesday. Yeah, yeah, but it does seem very morally.
Men, that's a good idea.
It all seems very morally, like the moral underpinning of this type of facility seems to be a subtext beyond the sort of benevolence. It seems to have this kind of strange morality to it, which I'm curious about.
Well, I think that's you can find that in any of those leading Victorian philanthropists that they were actually in many respects creating a built environment that was to reform people. So it's an environmental determinism that has faded largely from view in terms of planning thinking, but to a degree has aspects that do need to be taken quite seriously, and you find it mainly around crime prevention through design, that in fact the physical environment does have an effect on people, and that people will generally be better if they grow up in warm, comfy, well insulated houses, and so on. But whether it actually creates a better person, which was definitely very prevalent in Victorian thought, is another matter.
Sonya, in one of the talks you've given about weekend, and it might have been even one of your last, you mentioned that in a sense what you were doing with the work is giving something back to these bathers, making a work for them. Did you have a populace in mind? And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on what you meant by that comment.
Yeah, so that's a sort of that making for is a structure that I use quite a lot in my work, and it sort of helps me to have a protagonist or a group of protagonists in mind, as a way to sort of make decisions in the work. So it was a newspaper. I wanted to make for them a newspaper which was more of the pulls. So it wasn't necessarily something that maybe prescribed, or it took what their labor might have been during the day, and reworked it into a much more fluid or liquid, or a publication of sorts, but one that was had a different kind of intimacy to it, or a different agenda. The populace I had in mind was a totally imaginary group of bathers, worker bathers. So people who maybe caused the pool to become dirty in the first place, So it's a group of people rather than a sort of single protagonist, and the people who might have been, they may or may not have known each other. They were the people who might have been going there in their lunch hours or after work, or shift work, or whatever they might have been doing. Yeah, so it's an totally imaginary populace.
It's a beautiful expression of the generosity of the work, and it reminds me of two things. That analogy, also born through the Victorian period, of the art gallery, also as a kind of free public space for letting the body, soul, mind and spirit wander and be free, be liberated. And also the comment that you made when we first began to talk about what you would provide for the gallery visitors in the space, And you mentioned how at the Dowse, when photographing the work, you'd bumped into a woman who'd elected to make it her lunchtime. Was it a meditation space or, yeah. So a beautiful example of someone electing to use the space and this pool that you'd imagine for the workers in quite a different way as an immersive experience.
I suppose that's a really, I mean, the public art gallery goes back to those Victorian philanthropists. Well, it came out of more of a science and collecting kind of tradition, and the museums, etc. But you often find them in the industrial the philanthropic industrial new towns. There will be an art gallery and a library. Again, these were seen to be very improving, and there was that idea that in fact they were fundamental to education, whereas there's been a shift, I think, in terms of the way in which we think about museums in particular. They've tended to become more spectacular and sort of their entertainment rather than elevation as they were in the past. And I find that quite an interesting shift. And I think you can see that in libraries as well. Walk into the university library now, and it's very difficult to see a book. Certainly it connects with databases all over the place, but the university library is being increasingly given over to study spaces where people sit with their computers hooking into things. And it's fundamentally an education and research institution, but it's kind of shifting in terms of what its actual function is. And public libraries are becoming mediatheks. It probably underscores the fact that they're so important just for being places that bring people together. And
there were also sort of philosophic debates about human needs, of course, as you know very well, and what were the points, what was this sort of pointers towards enlightenment, human enlightenment, based on, a planned need. And a gallery was certainly associated with the development towards spiritual growth, particularly in this period. I'm also really fascinated as well by the correlation between New Zealand in the 19th century and the public pools here, and the differences, I guess, in points of access or similarities. I know you drew on the pool in Te Aroha, and the association between tourism and the hot pools in New Zealand was a phenomenon of the late 19th century. But it's interesting increasingly to see those places also have tiers of access attached to them. Was there anything additionally other than the physical proportions of that pool that you wanted to connect in through your sculpture steps that was in the centre of the room?
I didn't want to create too many parallels with St. Bride, because it's a very different situation in a very different part of the world, but it was built at about the same time, and it was built, the Te Aroha pool was built for travellers as a sort of therapeutic, a sort of respite centre for people moving between Auckland and Wellington, so they would bypass and have a bathe. As much as anything, I quite like to, especially if I'm, that project was based in London, and And it just felt right to kind of localize it as much as anything, as much as any sort of particular significance about that pool or that structure. It sort of needed to function formally. It had some parallels, but it also felt right to kind of bring it, locate it in New Zealand, and help me kind of locate myself in this new part of the world here as well, having recently moved to the Bay of Plenty. Just sort of, maybe it was something for me as much as anything else.
Well, I really enjoyed, Elizabeth, how you were able to draw in the current debates, for example, the Manukau pool, and what an extraordinary example of a free space. Almost, there are, as you have been pointing out, so few free utilities left in the city. It's mind-blowing, really, that any still exist. Certainly some are relatively inexpensive, but almost none free. And so conditioned are we now to anticipate paying for utilities that when we go to one and it's sort of $4 or something for a child, it's quite shocking. And it's almost in those moments of shock that you suddenly realize, well, of course, that's because the public pay for this resource in some regard. Where will the debate around the Manukau pool land? Do you know?
I don't know, and I'm not entirely certain of it. As far as I know, it hasn't landed yet, but it was certainly a contentious point, as indeed, you know, are many of the services provided across the city as the legacy councils have been combined. Some people have to put out a rubbish bag and a paid for bag, and people in Auckland City actually still get theirs collected, and so there's a kind of sort of an evening out, but the way in which things tend to even out is it tends to be in the city council's favour in terms of generating revenue rather than being equal. I mean, because we could have made public every public swimming pool in the free every public swimming pool in the city, but it doesn't quite work that way. But I thought it was really interesting too that Manukau had actually identified the importance of public swimming pools as a really major free recreational use in ways that other parts of the city hadn't.
Yes, no, I like that point. And also it's become so common for people to expect to pay for swimming lessons now. And of course, they're incredibly expensive and relatively inaccessible, in fact, I would say, to a great deal of people. So
yeah, and also health and safety. I mean, I thought that was kind of an interesting thing that I picked up from reading about Sonya's work, was that eventually the St Bride's pool was shut effectively for health and safety reasons. There's often a way that you can shut something down even if it's not particularly valid, because you could have actually maintained the place better. But that, as I noted, that's happening more and more with school swimming pools, and that was really, that was almost a right for every New Zealand child to go to a primary school where there was a swimming pool, which they probably hated having to get into, but they nonetheless, right from the start, learning to swim was really central to our education, but many schools are shutting them because they can't afford to maintain them, and that's got a lot to do with, of course, money going into education and where we choose to put it. But I think that's a huge loss, actually. But the use of Aotearoa and Rotorua are such kind of interesting examples of you know, hydrobathing and bathing for health and so on, that was really, it still is, you know, very much part of Europe. I mean, I lived for a while in France, and you could actually get a prescription from your doctor that would send you off to bathe for a while in some hydro spa, so that you could, you know, return to health. Now, that certainly has not been the case in New Zealand, apart from, I think, the Rotorua bars, which combined that really weird. I mean, they were run by the Department of Tourism, so they were really seen as an international tourist draw. You know, we were trying to become Baden-Baden in the South Pacific, and at the same time had all that kind of sort of medical infrastructure underlying. So run by the Department of Tourism and run by a balneologist, a specialist in baths. So, but I guess the whole idea of the bath and the public pool goes right back to the Romans.
Yes.
Where, you know, where in fact it has been said that the Roman baths were the equivalent of our supermarkets. That's where you went to, you know, check out the other citizens and exchange the gossip and by the by, you know, have indulge in a bit of hygiene, but that was kind of secondary. And you can see in a way in which those bars were actually decorated too, with, you know, enormous amounts of statuary and art, and I mean, really very, very, very different from our much more utilitarian idea of a swimming pool here.
Very much out of limits now.
I'm thinking of the time that Elizabeth's daughter Sarah and I visited Korea and went to the Korean baths, and what a culture shock that was. You know, you had that was where all the young, well, everybody went for health, but also to socialize. And you went there, you were given a pair of shorts and a t-shirt or a robe or something like that, and everyone had the same items of clothing, and you know, all the teenagers would go there because it was a way that they could go and, you know, see boys or girls, or, you know, and you'd have your barley tea, and it was all very very well behaved, but it was the place that you were allowed to go to socialize was a bathhouse. Yeah, and which is separate out into sexes.
And I think that's the case in many countries actually. And in fact, it was in New Zealand too. If you that wonderful other part of the Rotorua Museum, which is the blue bars. The blue bars were actually where you went to meet your beau, or and the way in which it was curated, and it's been shut for a while, but the way in which it was curated was to tell the social history of Rotorua, and yeah. And actually, a lot of public baths overseas, in places like Turkey and so on, are still very segregated. You certainly don't. You don't go there to meet a man. You go there to talk to other women.
Yes. All right. Well, I'm thinking we should probably say thank you to you both for joining us and giving a bit more oxygen to weekend, and just after what was supposed to be the last weekend of viewing the Walters Prize has just passed, and we're quite separated from it, unfortunately, due to our COVID restrictions. But this is a wonderful way to create almost like a parallel narrative around Sonia's work, Elizabeth. So thank you very much for doing it. and to Lucy and Amelia for hosting us, and we hope to get it online for all to participate in a online union, an online public space.
As we all sit alone together.
Yes.